On today's AMA episode, we have a question about how to properly measure opportunity costs, another question about whether retirees should consider investing in TIPS, which are inflation-protected bonds, and then last, a question about how to properly assemble a cohesive portfolio from your various different investment accounts. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, episode 142. I'm Jesse Kramer. I'm a financial planner working with retirees and people planning for retirement across the USA. You can learn more at planwithjesse.com. This week's review of the week is from Colorado Boy MJ, who left a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So Colorado Boy, send me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog and I'll get you a super soft podcast t-shirt mailed out your way. Thank you for the 5-star review. And with that, let's just dive into the AMA questions. The first one comes from Stephanie, who wrote in and said, Jesse, I see some confusing things online when it comes to opportunity cost. The first has to do with spending money on fun things. For example, a $5,000 vacation. People will say, but if you invested that money instead at 10% per year, you could have had $225,000 in 40 years. And yes, I think that math is correct. So that's Stephanie's first question. And then she says, also the opportunity cost of working with an advisor. Yes, Ramit Sethi talks about how a 1% annual fee will cost you 40% of your wealth over your lifetime. Do you agree, Jesse, with how these examples are illustrated? Stephanie, I love this question. And in short, do I agree? The answer is yes and no. I do agree somewhat, but then I think there's some important nuance we have to add. And I think the best and most way to fun start this answer is with a personal example. So, if my family changes nothing about our current financial situation and we continue saving and investing the slow and steady manner that we currently are, I bet we'll have around $5 million by the time we reach retirement age, as measured in today's dollars. The slow and steady trajectory of compound interest over 40 years, and that's our base case, $5 million. Let's just use that. Last year, 2025, looking at food, the category of food, groceries and restaurants in our household budget, we spent about $15,000 on food last year as a household. But I would say that if we truly went as cheap as possible, we're talking rice and beans and oats and peanut butter, some pasta, I bet you we could cut down our food expenditure to about $3,000 a year. So from $15,000 a year down to $3,000 a year. Or you could say about $12,000 a year in annual savings. Now, if we took that $12,000 a year in annual savings, we invested it all the way that we currently are, I think you could easily make an argument that our food habits are costing us something like $3 million by the time we retire, or something like 25% of our retirement nest egg. But that brings up three very important questions. Now, the first is, does it really make sense to scrutinize our expenses this way? And the second is kind of mathematically and logically, does it make sense to inflate those costs, in this case, the cost of food, does it make sense to inflate that cost into our future at our rate of investment at 10% per year? Does that make sense mathematically and logically? And then the third question I have is, are these pure costs? In other words, is there no benefit that we get from this expenditure? Is there nothing on the other side of the balance that we need to think about? So I think those are some really important questions. So we'll tackle the first question. Does it make sense to scrutinize all of our expenses this way? There's a gentleman by the name of Derek Tharp. He's a PhD researcher. He works for Michael Kitces, kitces.com, probably the most acclaimed website for financial planning education. And he took a look at this one in one of his articles. And some of the interesting examples that he came up for this hypothetical retiree he calls Sarah, he found that about 7% of Sarah's retirement nest egg was eaten up by the family trip that she went on to Disney World when she was 5 years old. Again, if you take the expense of that trip from when she was 5 years old, and if you were to inflate it at an investment rate until she retires, 7% of her retirement nest egg went to that Disney trip. About 20% of her retirement nest egg was eaten up by going to college, 27% due to her career-long daily coffee latte habit, 27% went to her latte habit. About 37% of her retirement nest egg was consumed by her parents feeding her from age 0 to 18. About 45% was eaten up by her buying a Honda Civic once every 10 years beginning at age 16. The point is that if you're going to analyze life this way, you're soon going to realize that all the mundane ways that you're spending money, if you want to inflate them at something like 9 or 10% per year for decades, you're going to end up with really big numbers. That's just the way that compound interest works. And this is a striking fact, but we know it. And compound interest, the whole point of it is that each extra decade matters more than the decade before it. So if we do this type of math for 60 years, like that Disney trip in this example that Sarah went on when she was 5 years old, it ends up being much more consequential than money she might have spent when she was 40. But I hope you agree with me here that this choice of analysis, I should say, is a slippery slope. It might start with asking yourself about that $10,000 vacation, which honestly, it's just a vacation. It's all extra. And you could invest that for another 25 years. And maybe that would equate to half a year's spending, right? And so that the $10,000 vacation, it's half a year of spending. It really means that you could retire 6 months earlier if you didn't go on that vacation. Okay, you could start the analysis there. But then are you going to analyze your groceries in the same way? Are you going to analyze the gas you put in your car the same way, the clothes you put on your back? The registration for your kid's T-ball league. There's a funny motif in the personal finance space about differentiating between frugal and cheap. The two adjectives obviously are similar, but frugal tends to have this good connotation while cheap has a bad connotation. And let me tell you, if you're skimping on gas and food and your kid's T-ball registration in order to retire 12 days sooner, I'm pretty sure you've jumped the shark into cheap territory, and it's not even close. It's one thing when you want to analyze all the extracurricular stuff in your life, and you want to ask yourself, what could this cost me if I chose to inflate it at an investment rate for the next few decades? It's totally different if you take all the legitimate, important ways that you spend money, like food, like gas in your car, and you start to think about life that way. I just think it's a slippery slope till you get some really gigantic numbers that are going to convince you to live life like a cheapskate. And I don't think that's really worthwhile. Let's go to the second question. And the second question was, mathematically and logically, does it make sense even to inflate these costs into our future at our investment rate? So if we go back to the $10,000 vacation example, imagine someone who had the choice of going on that vacation or putting those $10,000 to work into the two spouses' Roth IRAs. Now, in that case, I don't see a problem using an investment-like rate of return on that money. I get it. It's kind of this clear choice between vacation, Roth IRAs. Easy. And if it's going in the Roth IRAs and you're going to invest it for retirement, you know how you ought to be discounting that money back to today. But I'm going to counter my own argument with this. There are important reasons why Warren Buffett uses the risk-free Treasury rate when he's doing his version of opportunity cost analysis. Now, in that case, Buffett is analyzing maybe whether to buy a business or not. And in order to properly baseline himself, he uses the risk-free rate provided by U.S. Treasuries, which, as of this recording, is somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. So after adjusting for inflation, probably more like 1 to 1.5%. Now that discount rate, and that's what it's called, a discount rate, it's a massive part of the analysis here. It's huge. If you've invested, say, over the recent 10 years, you've watched your S&P 500 fund grow at 14% a year or whatever, and you use that as your discount rate. Well, if I used 14% as my discount rate, then my family grocery bill that I discussed earlier, a few minutes ago, that would cost me $20 million by the time I retire. That's actual math. $20 million by the time I retire. But if I instead use the inflation-adjusted Treasury rate of 1.5%, like Warren Buffett would, then the groceries would only cost us about $600,000. And almost all of that $600,000 would simply be the $12,000 a year in costs of the groceries. 40 years times $12,000 a year gets me to $480,000. In other words, almost none of it is wasted investment growth if you use a discount rate of 1.5%. The cost of spending money on groceries is basically just the cash out of my pocket itself. But if I inflate the grocery cost at 14% a year, that's where I get to $20 million of would-be retirement dollars that I'm foregoing. So by inflating these costs at a portfolio investment rate, we're assuming future returns. We're assuming future behavior that we're going to keep it invested. We assume that we invest 100% of those dollars instead of spending them on something else, right? So instead of spending the money on groceries, maybe I could go spend the money on a vacation or on a new car. No. I'm eschewing every single expense I possibly can and just dumping it all in my portfolio. Now, to each their own, but that really doesn't conform with reality as I experience it, as I see it. And this was kind of funny, the timing here. Another idea, the very famous FIRE blogger, Mr. Money Mustache, recently published a post called The Shockingly Simple Math of Social Security. And then I published a rebuttal right after called When the Shockingly Simple Math is Shockingly Wrong. And I'll link both articles in the show notes. But to make a long story short, Mr. Money Mustache concluded that collecting Social Security at age 62 is the optimal solution, because if you invest that money in index funds, and if you achieve a 6% inflation-adjusted return, we'll call it like a 9% nominal return, right? 6% inflation adjusted. He claims it'd be better than the return you would get by delaying Social Security maybe to age 67 or 70. And mathematically, that's true. If you compare the way that Social Security increases work between ages 62 and 70, and then if you compare that to a 9% rate of return, yeah, the 9% rate of return is better. But Mr. Money Mustache is repeating a very common and pretty major folly, because when we choose a discount rate, when we choose that, again, that opportunity cost rate, it's important that we match the risk of the cash flows. Now, in simple terms, that means that our discount rate has to reflect the risk that, in this case, is built into Social Security. A common phrase in discount rate discussions is your next best option of similar risk. So, does the risk of the stock market reflect the risk of Social Security? Certainly not. The Social Security annual increases that you'd earn by delaying your benefits are guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the US government. That's about as risk-free as it gets. Now, stock index funds, which candidly I own a ton of, I'm a big stock index fund guy, but stock index funds do not come close to meeting that high bar of being risk-free. I mean, after all, if we're going to use a 9% discount rate to reflect index fund investing, why not use a 20% discount rate that reflects Berkshire Hathaway's annualized return for the last 70 years? Why not use a 230% discount rate that reflects Bitcoin's annual return since inception? And I think the reason why is because those comparisons clearly are not apples to apples with Social Security. We just recognize that on its face. Using Berkshire Hathaway or Bitcoin-like returns to compare to Social Security just does not make sense. We all know it. Well, using a stock index fund return might be less egregious, but it suffers the same exact flaw. So how do we correct this error? What discount rate makes sense? I think we have to go back to that idea of the risk of the cash flows, or our next best option of similar risk. Social Security behaves like a government-guaranteed annuity with some inflation protection built in. So the next best option of similar risk would probably be something like TIPS, Treasury Inflation-Protected Securities. And the current TIPS yield ranges from about 1% to 2.5%. So that's a real inflation-adjusted return between 1 and 2.5%. So if we want to pick a number in there, let's say 2% is right in that range, where Mr. Money Mustache is using 6% as his inflation-adjusted discount rate, I would say that the right answer is 2%. And if you plug that into the same equations that he used, and you say that you want to live to age 90, well then clearly delaying Social Security to age 70 becomes optimal if you discount your future cash flows at 2%. And so I would argue that the shockingly simple math of Social Security is actually shockingly wrong. Anyway, that was a little bit of a digression about Social Security. I also think, for what it's worth, Social Security is certainly more nuanced than just thinking about yourself and your own situation, right? You have to think about your spouse. You have to think about ideas like it's longevity insurance, after all. Anyway, there's more than meets the eye. I wouldn't say that much about Social Security math is even simple, let alone shockingly simple. But going back to Stephanie's major question about opportunity costs, the third sub-question that I outlined to you about 10 minutes ago is that, are these things pure costs, right? Is there nothing involved on the other side of the balance? Meaning, when my family spends an extra $1,000 a month on food instead of just rice and beans, is there nothing we get in return? Could we measure our return in health outcomes? Could we measure it in the pleasure of eating good food and diverse flavors? Measure it in the joy of not eating peanut butter oatmeal for breakfast for the rest of my life? My point is, we're buying something. We're buying something beneficial with this money. When your family takes a trip to Disney World, is there nothing you get in return for that? No memories, no smiles, no relaxation. And getting back to the other part of the question that Stephanie asked, if you choose to spend 1% a year on your financial advisor, or $400 an hour, or $10,000 a year as a flat fee, you pay an accountant, you pay an attorney, you pay any professional, is there nothing that you get in return for that? And I think that's where Ramit Sethi and many others who use this math get it pretty wrong. Their analysis always shows two investors with the same exact financial life in every single way, except that one of them is paying a fee and the other one is not. Now, of course, if you present it that way, the side of the analysis with extra costs is going to come up worse. And that really assumes one of two things. It assumes that the advisor is adding zero value, or It's that the DIYer, the person who's not paying an advisor, has the financial planning knowledge and the experience and the behavioral fortitude, et cetera, to match the outcome of hiring a financial planner. Now, I do think some advisors add not much value, and I do think some DIYers are phenomenally knowledgeable. I interact with folks like you all the time. But I think, and many smart studies think, that advisor alpha, that's a term they use, that advisor alpha is a real thing. It's the added value that working with an advisor brings. That advisors can, and many do, add value to their clients' lives in excess of the fees that they are paid, and you can measure it in dollars and cents. So again, if you pay your plumber $2,000 to fix a clog in your front yard sewage pipes, is that a pure cost? Or are you preventing some problem from getting much worse, compounding against you, and then costing you way more in the long run? If you run a business and you pay an accountant $5,000 a year for a consultation that saves you 10% on your tax bill every year going forward, was that a pure cost? Or will it pay for itself in some really big way over the coming decades? And I think this example that Stephanie Ramit-Sethi bring to this episode is kind of similar. If you view an advisory relationship as a cost with zero benefit, well, of course you shouldn't pursue it. That's just common sense. In fact, we probably shouldn't even be talking about the costs then. We should instead focus on the fact that there's a bigger elephant in the room, which is why would these people exist in the first place if they're adding zero benefit to anyone's lives? I think the assumption of a pure cost and zero added value is probably a logical fallacy unto itself. So I don't agree with the illustration that Ramit-Sethi paints. At the same time, does he raise a good point about 1% fees? Sure, he does. He's copying John Bogle, by the way, who raised the same argument for decades before anyone else. Good for John Bogle. So then the question is, does John Bogle have a good point? I think, yeah, he does. The more time I spend in this industry, the more I realize that some of my work doesn't seem to scale with assets at all. It just doesn't. At the same time, some of my work does scale with a client's assets. And similarly, let's think about the responsibility I owe to my clients or owe to you, the listeners, the risk of screwing up someone's scenario. Does that responsibility scale with assets? Yeah, in some cases, absolutely. Does my risk exposure to my own errors scale with assets? Yep, it does. In other words, some portion of my work does seem to grow as people's portfolios grow. So, if I had a blank slate, I think that's the fee model that probably is the most logical for the work that I'm doing. I recognize that some of my work doesn't seem to scale, and everyone who shares in that work or everyone who gets the benefit of that work ought to share some sort of similar flat fee. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents on it. Thank you, Stephanie, for the great question. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I send a free weekly email to thousands of readers that shares 2 simple things, just 2. The first are my new articles and podcasts, so you'll never miss when I publish new content. And the second is my favorite financial content from other corners of the internet, so you can see what's been helping me the most.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
I hear you. I make this newsletter short, sweet, and full of essential information, and readers enjoy that. About 85% of newsletter subscribers are engaging with the newsletter more than once a month. They're enjoying it, and you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog, and you'll get a free PDF of my white paper titled The Step-by-Step Guide to Building Your Retirement Paycheck. That's right, a free weekly email that thousands of people like you are already reading, a free white paper to help you plan for retirement, and you can sign up for free at bestinterest.blog. Next, James writes in. James says, an AMA topic I would love to hear your thoughts on is Jason Zweig's enthusiasm for tips. He wrote another Wall Street Journal article over the past few days. He's almost got me convinced to really look into these to set a floor for the first 10 years of my retirement. Awesome question, James. Jason Zweig is a terrific writer who writes mostly for the Wall Street Journal, although I think he does have his own website. Maybe he just republishes his journal articles there. But anyway, Jason Zweig, highly recommend Jason Zweig. Let's get into the question. What are TIPS? TIPS, T-I-P-S, stands for Treasury Inflation-Protected Securities. It's a type of U.S. government bond, kind of like a simple treasury bond, but as the name implies, TIPS are set up to protect you against inflation. With a typical bond, your principal is fixed. You buy $1,000 of a bond, and the promise is that you're going to get your $1,000 back at the end of the term, plus a particular interest rate along the way. But with TIPS, the principal itself, the $1,000 part that I just mentioned, the principal itself can go up or down over its term. When the TIPS matures, when the individual asset matures, if the principal is higher than the original amount, you get that increased amount. But if the principal is equal or lower to the original amount, you don't get less than what you started with. They actually kind of bump you up to your original $1,000. We'll get into what forces can move that principal amount up or down. But TIPS, like all bonds, they also pay you an interest rate along the way. The interest rate is fixed for TIPS. It pays out every 6 months. And because the underlying principal is rising or falling with inflation, that means that your interest payments actually rise or fall in sync. So current TIPS rates, as I write this, are paying about 0.8% on the short end. So that's like a 1-year TIPS, and about 2.5% on the long end. So that'd be like a 30 years TIPS. Now, those rates, 0.8% on the short end, 2.5% on the long end, those are noticeably lower than regular Treasury note, Treasury bill, Treasury bond rates right now, which are about 3.7% on the 1 years and 4.9% on the 30 years. And the difference between the TIPS rates and the Treasury rates, again, if you measure, it's about 2.5% to 3% is the difference between those two rates. That's the implied rate of inflation that the bond market is expecting. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means if you take the 1-year TIPS, which are paying 0.8%, and you compare that to the 1-year Treasury, which are paying 3.7%, the difference between those two payouts is about 2.9%. And if inflation ends up being 2.9% over the next year, then the TIPS total return will be inflation 2.9 plus 0.8. And that's going to be the equivalent of the 1-year Treasury. If inflation ends up being higher than 2.9%, then the TIPS return is actually going to beat the 1-year Treasury return, and vice versa. The bond market itself, the investors, the buyers and sellers in the bond market, they know that's how this interaction works. And at least for today, they've pretty efficiently agreed on these interest rates. Thus, the bond market's implied rate of inflation over the next year is about 2.9%. Now, TIPS and I-bonds, very similar products, but they are slightly different. I-bonds are Treasury bonds that pay a fixed rate of interest as well as an additional layer of interest that varies with the current inflation rate. So it's interest plus interest instead of adjusting the principal value like TIPS do. I-bonds are available only to individuals. They're available with face values as low as $25 from the U.S. Treasury. I-bonds reach their final maturity in 30 years, but investors can begin cashing them in just 12 months after purchase. And I believe if you redeem them within 3 years, maybe within 5 years of buying them, you end up forfeiting some of your interest. Point is, I-bonds are really similar. There's also an inflation protection aspect, but they're slightly different. So what's good about TIPS or I-bonds for that matter? Like, why are we even addressing this question in the first place? The main reason why is because they are one of, if not the best asset at specifically addressing inflation risk. This one risk, inflation risk. That's what they're designed to address. You are guaranteed a positive real return, right? In the case of a 1-year TIPS that we mentioned a minute ago with a 0.8% interest rate, you are guaranteed to get your money back plus inflation plus another 0.8%. That is certainly an interesting value proposition for investors, especially someone who's looking to match some sort of specific asset today against a specific liability in their future financial plan. But what are the downsides of TIPS? Well, for starters, because TIPS are inflation linked, their fixed interest rate is just similarly lower. It's just much lower than that of a standard Treasury bond. We already discussed this. It's that risk-return trade-off. Investors demand less nominal yield for accepting inflation risk. But then there's another little added wrinkle. Because of the fact that we're shirking inflation risk altogether, we expect the total return of TIPS to actually be lower than the total return of treasuries over the long run. Maybe not every year, as there will be years where inflation surprises us by being higher than expected, and in those years, TIPS will outperform plain treasuries. But over the long run, because TIPS are just totally ignoring inflation risk, or what I should say is that they've been designed to absorb all the inflation risk, they just have less risk, and it probably means they're going to underperform a similar term treasury over the long run. Now, second, just because TIPS are linked to inflation, which they are, it doesn't mean that they're immune to interest rate shocks, right? Inflation and interest rates, two different things. And even though these two different things are often talked about at the same time, like 2022, right? Inflation was high post-COVID, and what did we do? We raised interest rates. So they're often talked about at the same time, interest rates being a tool to fight inflation, but they're two different things. And in 2022, when inflation got up around 9% at one point, I'm sure many of you must be thinking, well, TIPS must have done great that year. The principal value went up way more than we were expecting because inflation was high, and people still got their interest, and that must be a really good thing. But you know what else went up in 2022? Interest rates went up, and TIPS are not immune to interest rate risk. And you could look at, for example, an index of TIPS maintained by Bloomberg. It's called the Bloomberg 1 to 10 year U.S. Government Inflation-Linked Bond Index, and it measures the performance of U.S. TIPS with maturities between 1 and 10 years. And that index dropped about 15% in 2022. And it didn't drop because inflation was low. Inflation was quite high. It dropped because interest rates went up so much that the interest rate risk of tips overshadowed any sort of inflation adjustments along the way. And the longer the tips, meaning 30 years versus 5 years, the greater the interest rate risk. So anyway, inflation and interest rate risk, two very different things, and tips are not immune to interest rate risk. And then the last one I'll say is there are some peculiar tax planning idiosyncrasies with tips. Tips interest is taxed as ordinary income, but the inflation adjustment is not taxed until the bond is held to maturity. So anyway, just a little wrinkle. James, in his question, talks about possibly using tips to set the floor for the first 10 years of his retirement. And listen, James, I certainly think you could do worse than this. Not a bad plan at all, especially if you're concerned specifically about inflation risk. Personally, if inflation risk was that strong in my mind, I still think I would hedge my bets and build maybe half my ladder with tips and the other half with regular treasuries. That way, whether inflation surprises to the upside or to the downside, you always know you're going to be about half right and half wrong. And then there's often another question that pops up, which is, why don't I just build a 30-year tips ladder to cover my entire retirement? Inflation protection, 100% guaranteed for the next 30 years. I get where the logic comes from, but to me at least, this would be an example of like the ultimate trade-off between absolute security in exchange for limited spending, limited assets passed down to my heirs, in exchange for having that last check bounce at my death, that type of scenario. I think most people don't want limited spending. They don't want their last check to bounce. They don't want to leave nothing to their heirs. Yeah, they do want some security in their retirement plan, especially in the near term, but they also want there to be some sort of longer term growth engine for the later half or the later 2/3 of their retirement. And they want that growth engine for whatever, their own reasons. And anyway, tips don't really answer that need, and tips present kind of a long-term growth risk for retirees. So anyway, James, thank you for the question. I hope that helped you out. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I love getting your questions, and some of you ask me questions about the wealth management firm I work for in Rochester, New York. Others ask about the Best Interest blog and this podcast, Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, which operate without advertising, without pushy sales, and with no paywalls. How can the blog and podcast stay afloat without me dumping my own money into it? Well, to answer both those questions, I want to point you to episode 78 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. I intentionally recorded episode 78 to shine light on those topics and inform you how you are actually helping and can continue helping these projects carry forward. So if you've ever been curious about the business of my blog and podcast, or if you're curious about my day job in wealth management, please check out episode 78 and let me know what you think. And then last today, we have a question from Dave B. Dave talks about in his relationship, they each have a 401k being rolled into IRAs. They have an HSA in Fidelity. They have IRAs and Roth IRAs at Vanguard. They also have a joint taxable account at Vanguard. And his first question is, do you have any ideas on the best way to portfoliotize this entire mess? That is, should we be diversified in each and every account and take certain percentages from them year by year? Do we diversify across all the accounts in each institution? Do we diversify across all the accounts in total? So Dave, thanks very much for writing in. I really like this question. I actually see two main questions, so let me know if you agree here. The first, or at least easier question to answer, is that, if you're asking, I think you should consolidate all of your accounts with one custodian. There's simply not enough good reasons to keep different accounts at Schwab and Fidelity and Vanguard and all the others. I think just consolidate as much as you possibly can. The second and certainly harder question, I think the question you're really asking is, how do I allocate inside each of these different accounts such that they are good parts of the whole portfolio? Should you focus on asset location or tax location to ensure that you're housing your assets kind of as efficiently as possible? And so anyway, or, do you think of just, should each account look the same, just to make it simple? If your total portfolio needs to be 60-40, should every single account be 60-40? I think that's kind of what you're getting at here. Now, my short summary view is that you can think of it like this. Asset allocation is that's your broad investment philosophy, and that's just a fundamental part of financial planning. Whereas asset location, the specific assets that go into specific accounts, that's part of your tax strategy. It's certainly nice to get right, but it's not quite as fundamental as asset allocation. So allocation versus location, I know they sound very similar. I'm sorry about that. One is foundational. The other one is just kind of a nice to have. It's incremental. I'll kind of pose to you a couple different ways to solve this problem that, hey, all really smart people talk about. So both of these solutions that I'm about to talk about are vouched for by some pretty smart folks, but they're just different ways to solve the problem. So we're going to start with the Bogleheads, right? Disciples of John Bogle who really value simplicity. And I would say that the traditional Boglehead way of solving this problem, very simple, very straightforward. They would say that 1, asset allocation dominates results. 2, simplicity is a feature, not a bug. Simple is better than complex. 3, to worry about asset location. It adds complexity without a guaranteed payoff. And that 4, having identical kind of mirrored allocations across all your different accounts, it makes everything very clear from a risk point of view and ensures your true risk exposure stays consistent across your entire portfolio. So in short, you've got a bunch of plenty smart investors here who say that the best way to portfoliotize your assets is to come up with the right asset allocation for you. That is, percentage of stocks, bonds, and cash in total, and then do your best to mirror that same allocation across all your different accounts. Is it simple? Absolutely it is. Does it leave some potential tax optimization on the table? It certainly does. Now, do each of us need to find a balance between simple enough that we can execute it and stick with it versus complex enough to capture as much of the juice as we can possibly squeeze? Yeah, I think that balance is going to look different for every single one of us. But anyway, that's the Bogleheads approach. So a bunch of smart people, especially those who like to think about taxes and tax planning, would push back on that simple Boglehead approach. And they would say, 1, taxes are a legitimate drag on investment returns and therefore need to be considered. 2, getting asset location correct can materially increase your after-tax wealth. I wrote an article, I'll link it in the show notes, and really what it links out to is a deep Vanguard study that showed for the average investor, something like 0.1% to 0.2% per year in increased returns due to optimizing their asset location. And depending on how big your accounts are and your personal tax bracket, that number could be as low as 0, but it could grow as high as to like 0.4, 0.5% per year. So anyway, so the point there is that getting asset location right, it can add up. It really can matter. And then the third point that I think people would push back on Bogleheads is they might say, hey, you're already managing a semi-complex retirement plan. Why should it matter to add one more semi-complex lever? You're already doing it. And tax location, asset location isn't any more complex than some of the other components of your retirement plan. And I think these people would argue that, yes, you should start with your overall asset allocation, and then you should intelligently locate those assets to try to minimize your long-term tax drag. For example, if someone has $1 million in each of a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, and a taxable account, and their financial plan suggests overall that they ought to be something like 60-40 stocks and bonds, then what they would do, probably, the asset locator at least, would take all $1 million in the taxable account and invest in stocks. Because stocks tend to be much more tax efficient than bonds. And inside the taxable account, you're going to pay some taxes, so you'd rather pay those on the tax-efficient assets, the stocks, instead of the bonds. So taxable account, 100% stocks. And then you're going to take all $1 million from the traditional IRA account. You're probably going to invest that in bonds. Bonds are tax inefficient, but that doesn't really matter inside of a traditional IRA. And then that leaves us with the Roth IRA. You still need to allocate $800,000 more to stocks and $200,000 more to bonds in order to meet the overall 60-40 allocation. And you would do that inside the Roth IRA. Now, the Roth IRA could technically also be a good tax shelter for the bonds, just like the traditional IRA is. But all else being equal, we'd probably prefer to have our growth assets in a Roth account over a traditional account, because in the long run, the income tax benefit of Roth accounts means we'd probably rather have that one grow really, really big because we never pay tax on it again. So anyway, that's why we put the bonds in the traditional account and we try to put the rest of our stocks into our Roth account. Now, this idea, as I've presented it, creates a little bit of a mini problem. And that problem is that generally, when you need to withdraw money from your portfolio to support your lifestyle and retirement, the baseline order of operations is you withdraw from your taxable account first, from your traditional accounts second, and from your Roth accounts last. So I spent a lot of time diving into detail on that withdrawal framework back on episode 121 and included many corner cases where the framework actually has nuance, but the basic framework is taxable accounts first, traditional accounts second, Roth accounts third. Episode 121 if you want to learn more. Nevertheless, most of the time for retirees, your taxable account, taxable brokerage account, that's the first place where we want to withdraw from. But wait a second, because most of the time for most retirees, our cash and our bonds are the source of our near-term liquidity. Our stocks are the source of our long-term growth. But if I'm supposed to withdraw from my taxable account first, but my taxable account doesn't have any bonds in it, it's just all stocks, that kind of presents a little bit of a philosophical problem. How am I supposed to withdraw cash and bonds from my account in my taxable account if it's all stocks? So the short answer is, yeah, it's a little bit of a problem, but at the same time, it might not be a problem. It depends on how you want to think about it and your comfort with numbers. Because the solution that is most frequently offered up is to play this kind of mini shell game, but in a good way, not in a bad way, a mini shell game in your own accounts that does get you to the same place where you want to be. So let's say you need $10,000 this month for your retirement expenses. Proponents of this idea that I'm kind of going to walk you through, they would say that, yeah, you need to sell $10,000 of your stocks from your taxable brokerage account, and you need to move that out to your bank. That's the $10,000 you need, and it's now in cash. So we're going to check that off. We've met our cash needs. But as we just alluded to, you really didn't want to sell the stocks. What you wanted to do was sell bonds. So what you want to do next, though, and this is kind of the secret sauce, is you would log into or open up, I should say, one of your other accounts. Now, in my scenario, I would go to the Roth IRA. And inside my Roth IRA, where I own, 80% stocks, 20% bonds, I'm going to sell $10,000 worth of bonds there, and I'm going to buy $10,000 worth of stocks inside of my Roth IRA. So if we zoom out and just look across all my accounts, you'd see that I sold 10,000 of stocks, but then I bought 10,000 of stocks, right? I sold from the taxable account, but I bought in the Roth account. So on net, my stock balance hasn't changed at all. Then I did sell $10,000 worth of bonds from my Roth IRA, which aligns with how I wanted to fund my near-term needs. I wanted to sell bonds to fund my near-term needs. And then if I look at the account balances themselves, the only account that went down $10,000 in value was my taxable account, which fits in with my general withdrawal order of operations. My point is that it all checks out. Some people call this, I think, synthetic. I created a synthetic paycheck for myself because even though you could make the argument that I had to sell stocks out of my taxable account to fund my retirement needs, on net, if you zoom out my portfolio, really what I sold was bonds. What are the reasons not to go down this slightly more complex path? And some of you listeners might be cursing me out because it might sound much more complex than slightly complex, but I swear it's only just a little more complex because it's not crazy math, but it is more math than the simple solution where every single account was mirrored. Another reason you might not want to go down this path is that every single family's situation here is going to be unique because it's all a function of your specific account balances. My hypothetical with $1 million each in 3 different accounts, it's very clean, very easy to manage. So your mileage is going to vary here depending on kind of how much money you have in all your various different accounts. And then the third reason you might not want to go down this path is that the tax rates really matter here. Granted, if you have higher tax rates, could totally be worth thinking about. But I just ran all the numbers for a retiree who I would consider to kind of be in the solid center of my audience. This is someone who might have a few $1 million by the time they retire, but probably has less than $10 million by the time they retire. It's someone who might be living on $10,000, $15,000 a month right now, but probably is not living on $50,000 a month right now. And based on those numbers, I assumed state and federal tax rates, income tax, capital gains tax, that would illustrate that retiree's scenario. And then I ran 2 30-year retirement scenarios. One scenario optimizes the tax location of all the assets per the rules that we just outlined a few minutes ago. And the other scenario simply locates the assets in an easy 60-40 allocation across all 3 accounts. And both scenarios use annual rebalancing, which I think makes sense to get us back to the 60-40 allocation, I should say. And both scenarios follow the rule of thumb where we withdraw from the taxable account first, the traditional account second, the Roth account last. Now, if I take all those assumptions and I look at the difference between the person who's tax optimizing perfectly versus the person who doesn't care about tax optimization at all, the optimal scenario saw annual returns of 6.96% per year. And then the easy button scenario saw returns of 6.92% per year. Again, that was 6.96 versus 6.92, a 30-year difference of 0.04%, 4/100% per year. Now, over 30 years, that compounds to a total difference of about 1.1%. And on, say, a $3 million account, that equates to about $1,200 a year. Now, as I just said, everyone's numbers are going to change the outcome here. Your account size matter, the ratio of your different accounts matters, how much is taxable, et cetera, et cetera. Essentially, if you're paying high tax rates on all your capital gains, on all your income, on all your IRA withdrawals, then you might care about tax location a lot. So anyway, where do I land on it personally? Well, people hire me to look at this, and my job is to pay attention and optimize it, to at least explore the second camp for my clients, to at least question for them whether the juice is worth the squeeze. And earlier I mentioned a number, $1,200 a year about a minute ago. Now, Would you bend over and pick up $1,200 if it was just lying there on the ground? Absolutely, you would. But is setting this up as easy as bending over to pick up that money? Well, not quite. And by making this a little complex, do you run the risk of maybe shooting yourself in the foot and costing yourself more than $1,200 a year? Yeah, you run that risk a little bit. So if you're a DIYer out there, my simple question to you is, would you prefer a set and forget strategy that is really, really easy to follow, or a strategy that, yeah, you need to pay some attention to, you need to stay on top of, that's probably going to save you somewhere between a few hundred and a few $1,000s per year? I've said it before on this very topic, and I'll say it again. It's not that it's not worth doing. It's just that it's not worth making it your top priority, right? There are other dials to turn in your financial plan that are certainly going to create more than 0.04% per year of value. I wrote an article back in February 2026. I'll link it in the show notes. It's called The Long-Term Investor's Order of Operations. And basically, the whole point of the article was that some investors get intrigued by these shiny objects in the world of financial planning, and they pursue those shiny objects even when there are much bigger, more important objects that they probably ought to be pursuing. So my list in that article, my order of operations list, is an attempt to help investors prioritize which operations they ought to pursue first. And then only after successfully checking off the most important operations should you then move on to the less important operations. So I won't spoil all 10 items on my list, at least not in this episode. Again, the link is in the show notes, but I will tell you that this whole topic of tax location or asset location, which assets go into which accounts, it's number 7 on my list of 10 items. There are 6 other really important things that you want to get right before you worry about tax location, asset location. So anyway, it's not that it's not important. It's just that, yeah, for me, it's number 7 out of 10 on my list. So thank you, Dave, for the great question. I hope you learned something and it was helpful. And listeners, thank you all, as always, for tuning in to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.